today, today would be an interesting thing just to kind of think about what I are directing my insights through in terms of the US culture. So, I do apologize. My background today is not actually the common background. We had a few storms here in Chicago, so you're going to see behind me is not my natural kind of background. It is I'm in a utility room in my house, letting the workers work in my office. So it's just what we do, right? We adapt in cultures. So, and I'm just going to do one thing. Just 2 seconds. I'm sorry. That is to close the door so I don't get interrupted by the noise. So I do have a few slides. I'm not a big slide deck sort of person, but I do have a few slides. And part of this is to kind of bring in, obviously, there is a lot of people that that do understand the history of what is essentially the Cold War between let's call it the West and the Soviet bloc. And historically, of course, that is, I looked at that from an historical point of view as kind of the fall of the Berlin Wall as a 15-year-old kid in Australia. So my perspective was kind of rather sheltered, even though we were aware of it. It was something that was far off, and something we never thought we would have to be exposed to in terms of the direct impact of it. However, fast forward to today, and as Victoria said, I'm married to a Polish lady who actually grew up in this experience. So this was interesting to me. And so, of course, again, from an historical point of view, I wanted to learn from her how this forms the mindset of the Polish people and so on and so forth. And then, of course, now I can kind of look at it and how it informs the current day mindset of the US people and their experience with this dynamic. And of course, we're talking about the effect of the conflict, or the perception of the conflict that is going on now with Russia and Ukraine. It's important to kind of think about that history. When we're talking in a business sense, we bring in this aspect of this kind of historical perspective of Americans at looking at people from behind the Iron Curtain, the old Iron Curtain, as the kind of a very dark and mysterious world, with the color red always being prominent from the other side. And of course, that's an older generation thing, but some of the practices, some of the mindsets of the US people do permeate through to the current day. Now, we see this obviously in different regions of the country in different ways. Of course, today I'm going to obviously bring in the aspects of a very simplistic us versus them dynamic behind politics and the way that it constructs itself in this country. But this is kind of the old mindset, the old kind of romantic. Some people think of it as a romantic time of the old style kind of conflict, where you can look from an old horizon and think about, well, it's a very kind of dark and mysterious time. And of course, the story is always written by the victors. So in this case, there's probably a lot of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, which has been kind of even more heavily cemented in this type of experience. And then we can kind of think about some of the more recent events. And when I'm talking to professionals in the business world, they obviously want to know, because some of the recent history is impacting their business decisions today. And of course, this is just one example where the summit in 2018, where there were some very, very, what people would say, strange political approaches from the leadership that existed at that time. And of course, I'm coming from this from I don't call it a higher level cultural plane. I call it a different level. I'm not a political person, so I'm not making a comment on the rights and wrongs of this. But you can see that the interaction, really, people are talking about that the current situation we're in at the moment may have kind of been encouraged, right? Vladimir Putin's whole excursion in this sense may have been encouraged by the lack of engagement, or the style of engagement which was directed to him historically. So, of course, this is not only just from the more progressive side of the politics in this country, but even from some of the aspects of the Conservative Party in this country. This was quite a surprising turn of events. Literally, when the president gets up and says, well, I actually believe our adversary over the findings of our domestic security people. So this was kind of a very unusual thing, and and I think we're going to see the ramifications of this for quite some time, not just in relation to Russia. Now, of course, I've mentioned my daughter before. My daughter, was very impacted emotionally by the start of this war, and she is one that took on she started thinking about how can I help, so the neighbors like close by to a country that she certainly loves at her heart. And one of the things that she came up with was to gather medical supplies. And what started out as a little small idea turned into quite a large idea. And of course, this is a representation of the initial reaction that we saw in the US, an outpouring of kind of love and support and fellowship and brothership, especially in a place like Chicago, where I come from, where there is a large Ukrainian population. And we were able to tap into that, and of course that we saw images, as we say here, the shell-shocked and displaced people from Ukraine. Those images permeated the media here quite strongly. I think that even though it was initial shock, pretty soon it started to fade away, right? And just like most things in the US, it is a very reactionary culture from my perspective. I'm bringing in from a business perspective. The reactionary short-term thinking really kicked in, because then it became more about as it says here, the personal cost of gas and food, and an economy which was still struggling to come out of a pandemic, which was very impactful for the whole world. But for a place like America, seemed so much more kind of centralized in the US. So this was kind of fairly quickly, it kind of faded away. I think Christian, who was going to join me today, said, his personal observation, and I think when I reflect on it too, as you travel this country, there were far less blue and yellow flags that were appearing than initially. And then, of course, we kind of want to find out, okay, what is the data behind all this? Because I want to make sure that I'm giving people the right data in terms of the business people that I work with. And of course, this just shows the evolution. February 2023, only 48% of Americans really kind of think about this in a favorable, or the support for Ukraine in a favorable way. And then we go through to kind of now, early on it was 60%, it was a mass majority. Now that might still seem low. Now, for reasons that this was strange to me when I looked at this data. I thought, well, I would have thought it'd been more, but actually it probably was more, and for reasons why we'll talk about here in a second. Now, when you think about the US culture and looking at what they see as the most important foreign policy issues, well, of course, it really might have been that first reaction and the first observation of what was going on in the conflict. But essentially, really, it doesn't even make the top 5 in terms of the impact of foreign policy decisions. Terrorism, immigration, cyber attacks, drug trafficking, and climate change, right? These are things that are on the top of the mind of Americans. And of course, we can translate this into a very insular kind of mindset, right? They're thinking about what's important domestically, not so much as what's outside. And it's only these kind of small little kind of earthquakes that bring it to their attention in a short span. But really now with Chinese global expansion is more important than, seem to be having more an effect on the US people than the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's quite low when we're talking about when topics come up for people in these conversations. Now, this was it's interesting to me, although I probably could have anticipated this, that when a lot of polling has been done, no matter what kind of organisation it is, there was a very distinct low awareness of foreign policy issues, full stop. And using terms which Europeans and Asian people and even people from Australia and African people might use, of multilateralism and isolationism and things like that, these were terms that were not actually seen to be very familiar to Americans because they weren't contextualized in terms of how the US and the US people see themselves in the world. Because this is a country essentially, there's a great song by the Eagles. As a musician, I love bringing music into it. There's a great song by the Eagles. It was written in the 70s called The Last Resort. And it is about this country being the last stop, the last possible stop for a lot of people. And that's the way Americans see themselves in general, right? This is the place where people come when they're downtrodden, when they're experiencing hardship and all those kind of things, which makes it difficult from a business point of view for professionals, educated, high-level professionals coming to this country with foreign accents, being almost treated in the public sphere as if, oh, you must have come here because you are escaping some kind of hardship or something like that. Even the highest executives experience this, which is very strange, right? And I have to explain it to them as a professional why that is driven by the culture. So how do we kind of take that out of the equation? Well, I think this is a very clever thing. There was a kind of a set of indexes created so that we could actually get down to the definitions of the isolationism, stability and engagement attitudes of Americans. So they had to kind of go through using terms like soft power and foreign aid, overseas military engagement, trade and investment. These were specific terms that were very kind of pointed to a specific set of circumstances that an American might have in their own life. And then it became, so this is just an explanation for me. I found it fascinating, and maybe I would hope that as interculturalists, you would think about this in discussions you're having with any clients that are coming here, is that the level of sophistication of terminology that a European or an African person or an Asian person might have does not exist in the vernacular of the US terminologies. So and I'm not impugning the intelligence of Americans by any means. I'm just saying it's just that it's that expansion of vocabulary that is hard to pinpoint attitudes. But of course, there is certainly a red and blue dynamic to this. The thing about America, it is kind of very binary in terms of its affiliations. And of course, this is the average of 40% of voters favoring isolationism, 30% want stability, and 17% want engagement. But when we're looking at Democrats and Republicans, the 45% of Republicans want isolationism, and we might kind of explain that by saying, okay, these are people that see themselves as much more independent and individualistic, maybe, than the average Democrat voter. Whereas you kind of see the balance going to more engagement for Democrats because they might be a little bit more progressive and more open-minded to the inclusion or the consideration of people from different backgrounds and so on and so forth. although the numbers are not completely striking. So this is why I kind of don't want to just blame everything on politics, right? This is very regional. It's much more nuanced than anything we see on the surface here. Certainly regionally, rural versus city, north versus south, east versus west. It has, you know, the work has to be done to understand where the person's going to, understand their dynamic, and what impact on their business is the area that they're going to have on them specifically. And just another little thing in terms of the evolution of the attitudes, we obviously see early on a very kind of high or thinking about this conflict in terms of its threat on the US. Early on, yes, they were very high, but now, of course, you see that kind of balance is going quite disparate. So we see kind of 29% of Republicans really not seeing it as a threat and thinking more individualistic, and of course they're on the opposite side in terms of the presidency at the moment. So, and we're in this kind of funny, well, let's not get into the politics of it, but it's a strange evolution of politics at the moment. But the maybe more the Republican side of the aisle are kind of thinking more about how do they gain power back, whereas the Democrat side are thinking, no, well, we actually want to look into the future a little bit more, and we want to kind of engage and still keep this at the top of our mind. Now, I want to speak a little bit just finally about the dynamic of diaspora, right? And this is something that I've discovered, which I found very interesting. So I'm, you know, maybe two things. Yes, I'll talk about the Polish aspect, but there's also the kind of Latin American aspect. Why I call it a conflicted diaspora is that there are immigrants in this country, literally Polish people that sit at our dinner table, that are actually 70% probably Republican, and even, you know, not to use Trump as a separate dynamic, but he is a separate dynamic in many ways. They are virulent Trump supporters. So of course that worked for them when they were the diaspora that was pushing back against illegal immigration. By the way, these are people who are not here documented, by the way, right? They're themselves, but they rationalize their opposition to other illegal immigration because they describe themselves as the right immigrant, the right kind of immigrant, right? So, but this conflicted diaspora now, the reason it's conflicted is that now they look at this conflict and they go, okay, so who do we support? Someone like Donald Trump, who, you know, and his supporters essentially kind of have a warm spot in their heart for someone like Vladimir Putin, right? Unfortunately. But on the other side, they remember the history of the impact of the Soviet Empire on their country. So it's difficult to draw them in on this discussion because now they've all gone quiet, right? And the conflict exists because you know, a psychologist I spoke to the other day said, you think about this conflict through the lens of when people come here, they're not necessarily looking back to their own country or the history of their own country. They're looking at their current situation and how that might be threatened. And that threat comes from things like crime, right? And all those kind of things, which a particular part of the conversation goes, well, crime is being bought by immigrants only, right? And that's a story that's a very kind of impactful and it's a stimulating story. It may not be true, but it does garner votes, right? It does garner votes. So that conflict exists. That tension is going to, I think, probably permeate for quite a while. So it's this kind of balance. How do this diaspora balance the argument on one side, saying we're here now, we have to be Americans and we have to kind of fight immigration. On the other hand, how can we look back over these old, you know, and over this old horizon through the lens of the hosts, or the old horizons of the hosts, and now kind of how do we kind of push back against this this expansionism from other countries, specifically Russia and China? So it's a very difficult discussion for them to have, and I'm not sure that they can square it a lot. I certainly am trying, you know, as a culturalist, but also a business person, having to sit in front of professionals that are coming here and at very high levels and managing people with these kind of diaspora attitudes. We have to kind of dig more. I'm certainly haven't come up with the answer. I really am drawing on the learnings that I can learn from people that are listening to this, and also the others that I engage with every day, to see maybe that's a prompt for a first question as we wrap up here. Is, you know, how do we kind of look at a diaspora in a particular country, and how do we help them square this conflict between their allegiances and the historical viewpoints of their own countries, and also maintaining or making their host country as good as it can be. So that's kind of where I wanted to wrap it up. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. No, I probably have gone a little bit. I'm sorry, Victoria. We started a little bit late, but that was kind of where I wanted to end up.
I do have a comment from the group on
Yes.
the chat. If you'd like, Brett, if that's okay, can I?
Yes, absolutely.
George Simons wrote, we need to look at the impact of the cultural diversity history, the cultural diversity history of the U.S., and the acculturation of immigrants over the past 175 years. Anglo dominance, religious prejudice, dehumanizing the waves of Southern Eastern Europeans, the Irish, the Chinese. George, would you like to comment further on this? And you'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, George.
Hi there. I got a lighting problem here, so I'm a ghost. I think, you know, I grew up, I'm an interculturalist because I grew up in the United States in Cleveland, Ohio area, where you could walk 3 blocks and hear another language spoke. Okay. My father was a barber. He had clients from all over the place. When we went fishing on the weekends, we had people from 6 different countries in it. And the one thing we suffered from was Anglo-Protestant repression. We were hated because we were Catholics. We were considered stupid because we were from Eastern Europe. And of course, we were the criminals of the lot. Okay. So that made people like my father, and I think the Poles you were talking about, probably in another generation, we want to be more American than the Americans. In other words, we want to fit in. So Americans are about fitting in and being accepted in their own country. So it's not surprising that the folks who have the leverage on the wheels here are looking to take advantage of that, as Donald Trump, for example. About that. So I think it's extremely important not just to talk about Americans, but get people to the point where they can talk about what they had to do to be Americans and what they still have to do to be Americans. And it's, you know, the attempt right now we're doing, I'm working with a researcher who has done a lot of work on Donald Trump's discourse and populism. And we're also working on decolonization issues. So I think there's a lot to be said for taking apart US history. I mean, 2 things that struck me. I love history, okay, so I'm happy to share it. 2 things that struck me. I looked at the newspapers back in the middle of the 1800s, and people were arguing about, we can't take over all of Mexico. We could easily do it militarily, but it would involve bringing too many inferior people into the country, okay? Number 2, if you look at the editorial cartoons, the Irish are small with their Irish caps and their black monkeys. Okay, so this is the country I grew up in, and I could still feel those things. And on the other hand, the acceptance of so many different cultures in the subculture, the inferior in our inferior cultures was a very enriching thing. And I think it's why I'm an interculturalist today. So the history, you know, we have to get Americans talking more deeply about who they are and what they have to do to fit in the various roles that the dominant classes in the United States have imposed on them and have, you know, brought us to this point. Amen. I talk too much, but go ahead.
Thanks, George. I agree with you. I think this question that comes up, I'm going to use the Polish again, you know, because I've got a direct. I sit around with friends and I say to them, I'm just trying to gently ask you why you have this attitude, why you have this anti-immigrant attitude when you're an immigrant yourself, and you know, they and then when they say, well, you know, it's you know, because these other people, they're coming here and taking all the jobs and all that kind of stuff, and okay, let's forget that conversation. But then I say, but what about the prejudice you experience as a Polish person? And they go, well, you know, that's just part of the deal. That's what you have to put up with. And I go, that's strange. Why do you have to put up with it? Because I've been in a situation in a coffee shop where my wife was being yelled at by a guy. This was the days after Donald Trump was elected. And literally, when my daughter was 6 years old, right, and a guy verbally accosted them to tell them to speak English, because if they don't, Donald Trump will kick them out. And I tell this to our friends, and they go, oh, but they're just silly people, right? And I say, well, okay, so should you look in the mirror and consider yourself just as silly because you just said the same thing about a Mexican person or an Indian person? And then, of course, the silence is deafening. So I think, George, you know, I'm not sure whether, you know, this is a country that's in some parts being regressive. I understand why we want to encourage US people to look at their history, but we're literally banning books now in this country. We're banning books, and when we're shutting down critical examination of the terrible events of history in terms of slavery and black. It's going the other way, you know. So it's difficult, and again, these are questions that I have to kind of have these discussions openly and honestly with clients that are coming here, because it affects their business. These are the people that are in their businesses that are thinking this way, right? We want to shut down education. We want to look forward, that kind of forward-thinking Americanism and exceptionalism. Which again is of the effect, I think, of the lowering of the awareness or the impact or the importance, the perception of importance of this conflict behind this very old horizon. That's why I call it an old horizon. It's still an old horizon.
It is,
because
yeah.
people, you know.
It's a very important issue for me, because it took me until I was in my 50s to stop being embarrassed in the USA about being Polish, partly. I mean, I've got three or four other things in there, including 6% Jewish and 6% Arab, and I had my DNA tested, and believe it or not, I'm only 1% Neanderthal, and Neanderthals are getting a bad rap anyway by the anthropologists these days. But what I found important was, well, another way to put it, another story. My dad and mom, when it was election time, my dad would say, mom would say to each other, well, I suppose we don't need to vote because you'll vote Republican, my dad, and I'll vote Democrat, and they'll just cancel each other out. So why should we go down to the polls? But the point there was, and I'm noticing here, this is a gaining trend in Ceotar. You and I are the two only guys that I can recognize here. There's a gender issue going on, very strong. And that gender issue is also related to the fact that probably the men you are talking to need to keep up that front. They won't talk about those stories. I don't know how many of the people that you run into in this Polish group who say that kind of thing, but it sounded like guys to me. Okay, mostly guys at least.
Yeah.
So we have a gender issue to deal with here. I just noticed that CSR Poland had its elections and there's not a single guy on the board now anymore. They're all women. So nothing against you all. I think feminism is a wonderful thing and you've made great progress. I'm paying attention to men, the boy crisis. You know, the thing that in the USA, okay, they did a survey on schools. Now let's assume that, Brett, you are a teacher, okay, and you're a US teacher and you get essays from girls and boys. You will inevitably grade the girls 15% or more higher than the boys if you know them. If you just get the essays as anonymous, the scores will more or less reflect the quality of the essay. But this is utterly incredible. I mean, in the USA, between the ages of 19 and 49, 80% of suicides are men. Men are not getting their sense of identity, the two things that they were told they were about, defending and providing. Well, women are providing for themselves very well these days, and that's a good thing. But the guys are not missing the role, see? Or then we send them off to someplace to get shot anyway in the military, or die in the labor situation. So, you know, we have to deal with the capitalistic 1% and the 10% on top if we want to understand America, and if we want to get more out of the quality of our population, to say nothing of involving the immigrants who have always brought wonderful things to this country. I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. But you triggered me. You triggered me.
Yes,
sorry.
Yes, and you know, Katarzyna is writing here to reply you, George, that it's not a gender issue with CSR Polska, because 5 people applied, 5 was elected, and all of them just happened to be women. So there is no discrimination here. We are afraid. But I think
you have to ask why.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there could be
why?
different reasons, George. I don't know. For instance, a coincidence or something else. But I would suggest that probably we could come back to this. There's a question that Brett asked at the end of his speech, and it's about diaspora, and I think it's about around diaspora. Yeah, and that was a good question. So if there could be any changes in this kind of mentality, so what do other people say? Do we need some reflection on this, or how situation has been changing over years? Because when I listen to you, Brett, I understand that some things has never changed since America was open, was discovered. Am I right? Quite reactive country rather than proactive, which I do not believe.
I'd like to add a little bit to this, if I might.
Sure.
Speaking of the diaspora, and also, Brett, you talked about the foreign issues that don't seem to be terribly important to a lot of Americans. I'd like to give a little bit of insight to that, if you don't mind. 1/3 of Americans own passports.
Right.
I'm an American. I live in Italy. If I get on a train, in 10 minutes, I'm in France. Another 10 minutes, I'm in Monte Carlo. I can very easily go all over the place, and it takes me no amount of time and no amount of money. If I'm an American and I want to experience something foreign, and I'm not talking Canada or Mexico, but something foreign, I need to get on a very expensive flight and fly for 7 or 8 hours before I can get anywhere. And you talk about the culture being very isolationist. I think that it's geographical also, because people don't have the money or the time off. We get 2 weeks holiday a year, or the time off to actually move and go see other cultures. There was a recent survey in the United States, 64% of Americans have never left the United States. So how can you expect them to be interested in foreign affairs if they can't even get out of the United States? But I think another huge issue that we have is our educational system, which doesn't focus at all on anything foreign. It doesn't surprise me, these numbers that you showed about a declining interest in Ukraine. And I don't think that the numbers are quite as meaningful as what they seem to be. By that, I mean this, the high school diplomas in 2020 were quite high. However, we still have some outliers. Tennessee has 24% of the population does not have a high school diploma. South Carolina, 23.66% of the population does not have a high school diploma. California, 23.21% of the population does not have a high school diploma. Bachelor's degree ranges from 23% to 37% of the population, depending on age. So you see, we don't have really a kind of higher education or even a very strong education to look outside our borders to try to understand other people. And since we don't have that as part of our education, you talk about book banning and all this, that's all a part of it too. We're being overwhelmed by this idea that there's more out there than just the United States. So we kind of are retracting as a culture a bit. The numbers don't surprise me, but I don't think they really reflect how our government's going to react to Ukraine. I think that the government officials that we have right now are really absolutely behind Ukraine and will continue supporting Ukraine, even though the numbers you show that the common population that's never traveled and can't, even though those numbers are dwindling, I don't think the support is dwindling at all.
Right. And just a couple of points on the geography. Yes, that's a factor, but my country of Australia, 68% of people have passports, right? And one might argue that we're we're probably much more isolated than America, than at least the continental US. But of course, we can tie that to the education. I grew up learning a lot about the world. My level of fear about the world was a lot lower before I pushed my boat off the shore than I think the average American. And I think that maybe and Victoria encouraged me to kind of add some things to afterwards. I'm going to add maybe a link to Seth Godin's talk on the education system and the historical investment in the education system in the US in the industrial age by the likes of Henry Ford and his ilk, that really essentially didn't invest in education from an altruistic point of view to make it as good as it can be. They invested in it to control it and make sure that Americans are only educated to a certain level so that they could be fed into factories and work on assembly lines. So that's just a simplistic view of his, but that again kind of does bring up that level of fear. If you're not taught about the rest of the world, then and then you don't have the money and the time to then engage in it, then you're kind of going to be restricted to do it. And on the other side, you think of Poland, where somebody, I don't know whether it's CETA, somebody shared some statistics. So I'm working at the moment with a lot of people going there from a pharmaceutical company from Arab countries and Middle Eastern countries and places like that. 84% of Polish people have never met a Muslim person. So that's in a country that is bordered by different countries, but they haven't even, I think surprisingly 78% haven't even met a German person. That is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And most of them probably live out near where Bastian lives in Wrocław. The rest of the country, I mean, so it's, yes, geography, it plays a part, but it's sometimes an excuse.
Yes, Cindy, thank you so much for your input. And yeah, that's interesting discussion because geography doesn't matter really. I was thinking when you were saying how many Americans have an opportunity to travel, I was thinking about Ukraine, of course, and then the majority of the population do not travel at all. Like more than 60% has never left the country. And it doesn't stop us from being interested in the political and economical and any other cultural affairs around the globe, because when you talk to Ukrainians here, so we know about America, we know about Europe, we know about Africa, less about Africa than something else. So geography is a good point, and it's not everything, of course, I think. And also I fully agree with you, Cindy, that of course the political powers in the USSR are backing Ukraine very, very, very strongly. And part of this commitment is also goes back to the Treaty of 1994, when there were 3 countries who guaranteed the nuclear safety of Ukraine, and those were the USA, the UK, and Russia. So basically, they are doing what they have what they promised to do back in 1994. But you know, I'm interested. The recent developments, it's not about Ukraine, of course, only. Yeah, there is a war, there is an invasion here, but of course the echo of this goes far beyond the borders. So how do you think that, you know, American policies or American attitudes towards other countries in Europe has changed during the last 2 years? Is there anything Americans have started to do more of or less of?
A lot of them tell me they turn off the news. They don't watch the news anymore. It's too depressing and they can't do anything about it. Sorry, Brett, go ahead.
Oh, no.
I mean, everyone is invited.
Anybody, yeah, no. I mean, there are many anecdotes. I've worked with, you know, I was going back and counting. I've worked with 30 Russian executives that came out of the country because of the company shutting down, right? Even they are surprised by these are obviously very, you know, I can pretty much guarantee all of them are very opposed to the war. It's one of the reasons they've got out. But you know, they're very surprised once they hit the shores here, just how insular the mindset is here, and even more insular that it's becoming. It's not a physical wall. It's really a psychological wall. As that maybe to your point, George, it's all too scary. It's all too hard. You know, we can think that we can affect things domestically, either, you know, positively or negatively, depending on your attitude. So it's a tough thing, you know. I just wish I wish the mindset would change here from a business point of view, where the labor situation here, in terms of very important point, Cindy, the labor situation here and the psychological drive to be seen, to be taken notice of, means that Americans just find they do not use their time to go and travel and engage in the rest of the world, because they're just focused on this constant drive of positiveness and the facade of financial success.
Thank you, Brett. And as interculturalists, do you experience any changes during the last, you know, year, for instance? Has anything changed for you personally as interculturalist?
Me personally, or
yeah,
anybody else? Yeah, definitely. Those conversations. These are very intentional conversations, maybe through the lens of more awareness of diversity and inclusion, because people that are coming here are asking, how am I going to be perceived? How do Americans see me now that my company is telling me that I have to take notice of this in this situation? And that has changed. And if I put my intercultural hat on now, that has, but it is a business approach. That has changed the way that I've answered those questions, because I have them openly and honestly, and it's different for an Indian person than it is for say a Polish person, you know, those kind of things. So around about accentism and all those kind of things. But it's changed how I've really directed my learning. That's me, right? Towards the people who are kind of going to teach me how to answer these questions. That's fundamentally changed my approach. Whereas historically, I would have just gone, well, we're just talking about, you know, the basics of culture and how to interact and lead people and motivate people and all these kind of things. Now they become very, very emotional and emotive, and in terms of, especially people who've got children, right, and they're anticipating their children being educated here. Actually, one of those, I'll just use one final thing. That one Russian executive said to me, he'd visited here quite a bit to the area he was moving to, and he said, I know it's a very diverse community where I'm going to. I don't have any worries at all about my children being taught and the skills of the teachers being and how they handle third culture kid identity and diversity in schools. And I just basically said that you are full of crap. I told him, I said, my daughter goes to one of the most diverse school districts in the country, and the teachers there are blind to the dynamics of the cultural influences of the children they teach. They invite me to speak to them about it because they realize their blindness. But this guy was just his perception that it was surely, if they're in a diverse, these teachers are well skilled up in this perception. And I go, well, I'm going to be very direct Russian back at you. And I said, that is absolute garbage. So you have to come here being prepared that you have to augment and encourage your children to do what you want them to do and be open to culture and understand cultures and things like that. I said, you have to take that responsibility. Don't leave it up to the teachers. Thank you, Katarzyna.
Yes, thank you, Kasia. Yeah, and I would invite everyone to ask questions or to have some comments because we've got only about 5 minutes left.
Hello, Rita.
Yes, good
Speaking
morning.
of one of my wonderful teachers.
No, you're my teacher, Brett, and hi, George, and hi, everybody. So I'm also a transplant, like Brett is in the US, coming from Germany and lived here for over 35 years now. And I came in late, I'm sorry, so I don't know what you talked about before. What you just said, Brett, is absolutely true. And we work with expats as well who come here from all over the world. And I think just like anybody who not anybody, but many people who live here, first of all, we've been so affected by COVID and by the pandemics, isolation, and mostly the kids. We had and so that's made things, of course, harder. And the stress level, I feel with adults and children is just so much higher, and that produces stress that, it's always stressful if you move abroad, right? But that makes it even harder. And we had an expat from actually Australia recently, Brett, that we worked with to the US. And he was moved to Portland, Oregon, which is one of the cities with the highest or very high number of homeless people. And the city also has a more progressive approach to homelessness, i.e. they don't just ship them out somewhere, but they try to, work with the homeless or accommodate them somehow. But it results in a very problematic sort of city landscape. And this couple was saying, we are in the middle of downtown Portland, which is a beautiful city on two rivers, not close to the coast, but in a beautiful state. But we look down on homeless encampments, and it almost reminds us of like a post-World War landscape, and we don't always feel that safe going out. And so, that's another aspect of sort of where we have come. And the same is true for some other cities in the US. I live in Atlanta, where it's also getting a bit out of control here, and add that to the already existing, dialogue here in the US politically. And, tomorrow we're going to expect some protests in New York when ex-President Trump will be formally arraigned and probably will go to prison. I mean, that's going to be a circus and a zoo, and hopefully nothing will happen, other than demonstrations that will hopefully be peaceful. But it's a difficult time to live, I think, anywhere, but in the US, to me, it's always this sort of country on steroids, right? It's either really great or really awful. And right now it's a really hard time for many people to kind of get through the day here. And oil prices are going up. The gas prices are going to go up again all over the world because of OPEC's decisions yesterday, and fear of recession. And then the elections coming next year, which is going to be another layer of complete stress for many people, and polarization. I don't feel so optimistic right now, although I try to be optimistic and I always will be, but we're in a sort of a to me, potentially crisis mode. Anyway, I don't want to add on that or end on that negative note necessarily, plus your time is almost up. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Brett, for bringing up these important questions and items, and thank you for your interest here.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, everyone, because that was an interesting discussion, and we've got some maybe old or new insights into what is happening in the USA and how the USA sees the world through the prism of their own spectacles. I think we need this, getting out of Europe from time to time to understand the world better. So thank you very much for participating, and we will send. Yes. And Cindy,
Yes.
are you saying that to me? Are we ready to announce the next DMeetUp? Yes.
Yes. So the next DMeetUp is the 1st of May.
Yes.
It will be at noon, and our speaker will be an actor named Sharif, and he will ask us this question: does your speaking voice enhance or inhibit your message?
Oh, that's interesting. So this is about the skill.
Yes.
That's great. So everyone who is interested in mastering this skill, you're very welcome on the 1st of May noon. Yeah. And today we would like to thank Brett once again for being our leader and the key speaker. And everyone who participated, thank you very much, and have a very nice rest of the day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For
Bye.
coming. See you soon.
See you.
Bye.